Okay. Hi, folks. I think we've got most people settling back in. Really grateful for the great conversations that we've had so far. We're right now discussing the chairs, which are much lower than you would think until you actually get up here. Yes, okay. Wonderful. Well, we wanted to have this conversation that looks at some of the other aspects of safeguards and protections around human rights and issues related to human rights, corruption, and arms. And so I'm really excited to have with us today David McKean from the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable, Sophie Richardson from Climate Rights International, and Kevin Hall from Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. Each of them will provide a little bit of an understanding of how different aspects of both civil society, business, and human rights defenders contribute to the overall conversation that we've had today. I also think that this is an important opportunity to think about when our community, when we talk about communities of practice around the issues of human rights, arms, and corruption, that it includes a wide community and a wide number of issues. That the more that we think about interconnectedness among issues like climate, issues related to business and human rights, and the protection of the media and free press. These are all aspects of the communities and the networks that we need to be building to be ready to meet this moment. So at this, Colby gave us a really great understanding of the risks that businesses can create as it relates to corruption. And so, David, I'm going to start with you. First of all, if people aren't familiar with ICAR, it would be great to just give a quick chapeau. But can you let us know why are companies important stakeholders in any discussion about human rights, particularly human rights and corruption? And then tell us a little more about the guardrails that governments should have in place to constrain businesses. And what is the status of the guardrails in the United States, the ones that they have put in place to address business, human rights, and corruption?
That's great. Thank you so much for having us and for this conference and for the ability to use the word chapeau. I always like to be able to do that. My name is Dave McKean. I'm the Executive Director of the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable. We're a convener of, basically every group that you would want in the space of corporate accountability and business and human rights work. So focusing on the intersection between company action and human rights, including environmental rights and labor rights issues. To get to your question, the guardrails, I don't think it's any secret that for the project of this administration, broadly speaking, I think could be summarized as seeking to remove any sort of infringement or guardrail on a company's ability to act. And I'm sure that I know that there are some exceptions and some things, but I think that's a fair characterization of the kind of overarching thinking of how this administration is treating the regulatory regime. Colby in the last panel talked about some of the scandals that led to the regulatory framework that he was thinking of, or that he was discussing. Those same scandals also gave rise to something called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which I'm sure many of you may be familiar with. It's an incredibly effective, not perfect, but very, very broadly speaking, effective regulatory and legal framework that has dramatically driven down rates of corruption by U.S. companies around the world. And it functions very simply from a legislative perspective. It's pretty kind of simple in its design. It basically says that if you are a U.S. company or a company that trades on a U.S. exchange, you can't engage in any acts of bribery or corruption anywhere in the world. And it makes the C-suite accountable for making sure that they comply with that law. And then it doesn't really give a ton of, guidance. There's lots of guidance now, but it doesn't, in the legislation, it doesn't really say exactly how you do that. It just makes sure that, it just says that's the prohibition. I think of it like a speed limit. Like, speed limits don't say, here's how you drive under 65 miles an hour. They just say, drive under 65, stay in your lane. And if you can adjust the radio and do other things while you're doing that, great. And if you can't, keep your eyes on the road and keep your foot off the gas pedal. And in February, we saw the Trump administration, through executive action, completely suspend the enforcement of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which means that companies, now there's a 5-year statute of limitation on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, so think about how, I think companies are thinking about what that might mean for potential future enforcement. But I just want to read one quick from the executive statement suspending the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act enforcement. It says, this is the president, or in the president's voice, FCPA enforcement has been against American citizens and businesses by our own government. The idea seems to be that there's a problem with the U.S. government enforcing a regulatory regime against U.S. businesses and against U.S. citizens, when that's obviously exactly who the U.S. government is designed to build a regulatory regime for and enforce it against. But so that's the FCPA, and that's the corruption aspect of it, and there's many other aspects of the corruption. On the human rights side, at least when it comes to businesses, like much of the energy on building regulatory regimes to keep businesses on the right side of human rights compliance and environmental compliance is taking place outside the U.S. Many of you may have been tracking or following the effort by the Europeans to enact mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. This is a regulatory framework known as the CSDDD. That has been broadly limited, due much to the effort of U.S. government and U.S. company intervention. So when you put these things together, you see that there's an effort or a kind of theory that the U.S. government shouldn't be enforcing regulatory regimes against U.S. companies or U.S. citizens, and also other jurisdictions, even though the companies are operating there and doing a ton of business there and are registered there in many cases, should not be regulating U.S. businesses. And when you put that together with limited enforcement of our, or some limited enforcement of our forced labor import bans or other things, you kind of see a broad approach to how to regulate businesses, which is essentially to say, we don't want there to be many, if any, guardrails on how you are able to operate in the world. And what that leads to, I think, as other panelists has shown, is companies having their kind of legitimate interests to be profit or semi-legitimate. We can get into what their legitimate interests are, but like what their existing interests are: profit motive, shareholder maximization. If that's your goal, and if that's the only thing you're accountable for, there's like very straightforward ways to do that. And those can look like, being a Dominican sugar company that's under a withhold and release order that can't import your goods, helping to pay for an East Wing renovation and watching your withhold and release order be lifted. And so that's the kind of corruption, human rights, environmental impact framework that we're seeing kind of be dismantled, and that we should all kind of care deeply about, both for many of the reasons you talked about and including the implications that it has for arms around the world. And maybe we can get into this, but that's further exacerbated by companies who see human rights defenders, independent media, as problems that they need to address, and whether they address them through civil litigation in the form of a slap lawsuit or other direct attacks. It's a very limited environment for folks to be able to operate, and the harms are so great. So maybe I'll leave it there and we can turn, but that's an overview.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much, David. And we can also get back to what Congressman Castro put forward, which is that there never was enough regulation, at least on 21st century technology. So if we're in an environment that has already been under-regulated for human rights concerns for the future, and the regulations that do exist around guardrails for human rights or corruption are not being implemented as it exists, we're in a very tenuous position. With that, Sophie, I am so thrilled to invite you to the stage because Climate Rights International is a new organization, but you are not new to me. We worked together for 13 years at a previous human rights organization, and I think what's great about the work that you all do, and I'll ask you to tell the audience some more, is that it's a group of individuals that came from a very human rights-centered background, now working on climate. And so can you actually tell us a bit more about the organization and tell us what human rights actually do have, what that has to do with climate? What role then does CRI see corruption play in both deepening the human rights and climate crises in some countries, and that relationship between the two? And what your work has shown about closed countries and the difficulty that individuals and organizations have to address rights and climate issues and repressive environments? Just some easy questions.
I was about to say, can I have 13 years to answer those questions?
Yeah.
I won't take that much time. Thank you very much for inviting me to join you. It's great to be with everybody today. Quickly about CRI, Climate Rights International, which just published its first report a little more than 2 years ago. The idea is essentially that to make progress on climate change, we have to do a better job of protecting human rights, and that we're not going to do very well on the human rights front if we don't do a better job of protecting the planet. So these things are quite inextricably linked. And so we're working with organizations all over the world to document the relationship between human rights and climate, and taking the research findings to governments, to corporations. We're obviously pretty pro guardrails. We'll talk more about that. To take urgent action to limit and remedy abuses, to radically limit greenhouse gas emissions, and to protect carbon sinks. And a very strong part of the organization's work is partnering with activists and people from affected communities to really push for justice and accountability, for people whose lives and livelihoods are literally on the line. We can talk a little bit more about some of the success stories. So what happens when there aren't guardrails, and when corporations and governments are ignoring human rights law in particular? I think CR's work already shows how people's, and especially indigenous people's, lives and interests suffer greatly. Particularly, they become a distant second to the interests of corporations, elites. The number, 6 months ago, I didn't know the names of so many mining companies. I do now. I know, for example, that China National Offshore Oil Corporation's revenues last year were greater than the gross domestic product of about 25 countries. These are some powerful, powerful interests. But just to give you some highlights of our work, for example, in many parts of Indonesia and in Mindanao in the southern Philippines, there's a lot of mining for nickel, which of course is a key element in producing green energy technology. But the way it's being mined is not only causing greater climate vulnerability, but it's harming health and food security and prompting death threats against anti-mining activists. So no guardrails there. Skyrocketing demand for avocados has prompted widespread deforestation in 2 states in Mexico, which is where the vast majority of avocados that are consumed worldwide are grown. And this has prompted not just the immediate problems of deforestation, but water shortages and increasing the likelihood of things like landslides and flooding. There's a very strong corruption dimension to that particular problem, where authorities are very well aware of and often complicit in and resistant to remedies around ending that deforestation. The East African crude oil pipeline, which cuts across Uganda, is a jointly run project of CNOOC, it's a massive Chinese state-owned enterprise, and Total Energies, which is a French drilling and fossil fuel company. The list of violations associated with pipeline construction is so long, I can't possibly read it to you even in 13 years. But land dispossession, physical abuse, threats, health harms. But it's also, this is one of the cases where there's actually been a success story that some incredibly brave Ugandan activists have really led the charge in pushing back against the pipeline. Through reporting on the abuses, And there's now a little bit more of a conversation between some of the company and state authorities with some of the communities that are likely to be most affected by the construction of the pipeline. And then across China, which is the country that I've worked on for a long time, and particularly in geographic regions that have minoritized communities, and I use that word very deliberately, the role of Chinese state-backed and private companies in everything from mining to infrastructure projects. And these problems are replicated around Chinese state-backed investments in other parts of the world. It's environmental harms, critics are silenced, a refusal to abide by well-established domestic, international, or Chinese law. We can talk about which one of those is supposed to take precedent. And forced labor or other kinds of labor rights violations. I hate saying this out loud, but it's true. In 2011, I oversaw a project looking at labor rights violations committed by the China Non-Ferrous Metals and Mining Company, which does not come tripping off the tongue, in copper mines in Zambia. And I'm very, very sad to report that last week I did a long interview with Inside Climate News about how that same firm is still committing environmental and labor rights violations. So there's still lots of work, I think, to be done. The common elements across all of these situations, again, with the guardrails, these are governments that have weak or deeply politicized institutions, especially legal systems that enable corruption and make powerful actors think they have complete impunity. Inequality, racism, discrimination, the lack of a free press, which we're going to talk about, and hostility to civil society. And one of the worst dimensions of this, of course, is that rather than fixing these climate harms, all of these elements combine to worsen them, which I think speaks to your point about why these different kinds of communities need to work together. I do want to just add one other slightly hopeful note, which is that we have seen some remarkable progress on the issue around avocados and deforestation in Mexico, which is largely a result of a lot of publicity, but also a push for some degree of accountability. But ultimately, part of the answer was getting Mexican authorities to agree to a certification program to make sure that the avocados that were being exported could be traced back to areas of those two states that were certified as not committing human rights violations or were not growing avocados on land that had been deforested. So you can eat your guacamole and not feel terrible about it. But also, more important, to know that there are pathways to success. This is not a completely hopeless enterprise. And part of the logic really is to push for respect for those guardrails. So I'm going to stop there, but hopefully we can come back to some of these issues in the Q&A.
Great, thanks so much, Sophie. And that was the question, can I eat my guacamole? I was off of Nutella for about 5 years after a project on palm oil in Indonesia. So yeah, I'm okay. Thank you. I really appreciate that. And Kevin, one of the things that we heard from Congressman Castro earlier this morning was the conversation around what are the rights that we need to think about, the right to reality, that as the information environment changes, that people need to be able to trust and have access to information. Access to information is already a human right. It's difficult if the regulatory environment is not working, if companies are not supplying the information that they're supposed to, if governments aren't asking for the information or publishing it. And so that's where we need a free press. And an organization like OCCRP, which I practice saying so that I wouldn't say ICCPR, OCCRP to provide exceptional investigative reporting on human rights and corruption issues around the world. Can you tell us more about your work, why a free press is fundamental to addressing human rights and corruption issues, and particularly when guardrails on business or repression of civil society is making it difficult for organizations to do and advocates to push back on abuses?
Sure, I thought you'd never ask. And a disclaimer, don't let the beard and the red jacket fool you. I do have a list, and I know which one of you are naughty and which are nice. So OCCRP, I like to say we're the largest newsroom you've never heard of. Before the AID debacle earlier this year, we were at about 240. And contrary to popular belief, no, we weren't funded by USAID. We did receive some contracts for very specific projects. But our motto is it takes a network to fight a network, right? Criminals operate in networks, they work together. So we built memberships and partners, organizations. We help fund certain organizations. We provide editorial resources. The idea is to build up the capacity for investigative journalism around the world with the idea that let's fight that network with a network. Again, a little bit about us, you know, we'll skip past that, but we're all over. We have like people in Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea, places you wouldn't expect to have a newsroom. And our very fear-mongering motto is, you know, a world where lives and livelihoods and democracy are not threatened by any. Sounds like scary stuff, right? This is kind of like apple pie, yet there's a lot of resistance. Unlike a conventional mainstream media that's looking for eyeballs on a story, we're looking for impact. So we're judged on whether our stories have impact. So this is kind of a rundown of the kind of things that have happened just in the last, 14 years, 15, 16 years. So, and we work a lot of times on independent investigation. Sometimes we get great leaks, like the prosecutor's files in Colombia, which then we spent 14 months organizing, reading, and if you really like to read a lot of emails, this is a great job for you. Similar, we rebuilt, we're able with, starting with data from C4ADS, kind of built a land registry, our own land registry of Dubai, and then being able to work that. There's more work coming in this space too, and to kind of identify all the bad actors there. So the reason I'm giving this whole thing, the whole idea is to turn headlines into action, right? So people can go in and take the Bulgarian criminal organization boss whose girlfriend gives away the goods by posting a photo of herself in Dubai, suddenly confirms he owns the property, and then you get pull on it. So that's the whole idea, continue to pull on threads globally. And the tool for many of you, it's not open access. You won't have the complete access to what some of the reporters have, but for researchers and NGOs, we do have access to Aleph, which is this massive proprietary database, and that allows you to compare, cross-reference, and it's a great tool. If you just go to our website, there's a link, and you can apply for access to it. And there's a public-facing access independent of all that, of Aleph. So that, again, you can see where we operate around the world, and all this to come to the answer to the question of, you know, press freedom. So one of our partners was killed in Slovakia. There's a movie about that, the killing of a journalist. Our entire partnership in Kyrgyzstan is under arrest. A number of our partners and people we just are in the same space with in Azerbaijan, certainly in Latin America as well, and we provide insurance, self-insurance to newsrooms starting up around the world called Reporter Shield. So these are all steps that we take to kind of try to help not build, not foster, but actually create an independent press in so many of these places where we don't have them, right? So that's kind of I'll leave that up there and then get to the question. So we're at a point where the mainstream media business model has shrunk. We have very little New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and then everybody else, right? And even those organizations, the narco files, notice we didn't have any major partners there, right? Well, one of the reasons, they don't have people who cover the DEA. You don't have people who used to cover these special things. DEA is kind of important today if we're blowing boats out of the water, right? And so we're losing with every passing year some of this institutional knowledge. The good news part of the story is online publications like Inside Crime and you know, Inside Climate Today, and all these publications are stepping in, and I'm confident that you know people aren't going to stop reporting. Information isn't, the need for information is still there. Now the environment, what is new is the platform, right? Anybody know what Rumble is? Rumble is kind of an alternative reality platform being built in Eastern Europe, where the Dan Bogninos and those kind of people are all they're running out of, so they're going to take the infrastructure for the internet out of the United States, the ability to regulate content and speech, and it's being portrayed as, you know, a fight back against the censorship society. But what it really is to try to create an alternative reality. And that's kind of the scary part of the future for journalism, is that we're siloing off to kind of two different views of reality. That's the America-centric view, but and perhaps the Eurocentric to a lesser extent. Now, the need for journalism is not just OCCRP, there's ProPublica, there's ICIJ, there's GJIN. There's a big growth in nonprofit newsrooms, and I think that's the good part of the story, is that people are stepping into the space, whether it's specialty like climate or whether it's you know, a range of things. The business reporting, I think, is the one thing that's been, as a former business reporter, that continues to be a healthy part of our business, thankfully. But journalists are under threat for simply doing their jobs in a way that they never have been before. And it's easy to point to governments, and you can say Viktor Orban in Hungary, or you can pick your places. But the other element is the organized crime element and cartels. Mexico is, you know, massive. I'll just run some numbers that I did last night ahead of today. This is from Reporters Without Borders. 67 media professionals killed over the last 12 months. 53 of them were killed over war or criminal networks. So cartels were about, I think, Gaza was 43%, 18% was Mexico. So almost 1 in 5 of the killings were extrajudicial killings by cartels or organized crime. Syria, as everybody's been following Syria, you know, we had 135 journalists missing in action around the world, 37 in Syria, 28 in Mexico, 12 in Iraq. So it's that, but it's also, there's a dark milestone. Saudi Arabia in June executed a guy, Turki al-Jasser, 7 years in prison for drummed up charges, and then executed. And he's the first journalist to be executed officially, I make that point, by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Obviously, the Turkish embassy bone saw story is extra official, but this was actual state-sanctioned execution. And that was only 2. An Iranian journalist was killed in 2000. So thankfully, on the official level, it's not as prevalent as on the unofficial level. Almost all of our people all around the world we've had to move people out of bureaus in Africa, out of Mexico. We're under constant threat, and security and legal costs are a huge part of our budget. Eating into the ability to report, which is one thing oligarchs do as well. They make it make it expensive to write about them. They don't win, but they want to bleed you. So does that kind of get at the answer?
I think so. And just reminding folks that one of the bills that Congressman Castro actually has sponsored is something called the Armas bill, which looks at how to track the flow of small arms to cartels in Mexico. And we've also seen the flow of small arms from the U.S. supporting organized crime and gangs in Haiti, for example. So the destabilizing effect of the flow of arms from the United States, not in the larger arms trade, but in the small arms that can actually have an impact on human rights. I want to pause because I have more questions, but I don't want to hog all of the questions. We've got about 10 minutes. I'm looking at Jeff. I was about to say 10 or 15, but really we have 10. Okay, 15's okay. For questions, so I'll open it up to the floor first before I turn some of my additional questions to you all. Does anybody have a question from the floor? John, we've got a mic coming to you.
Thank you all very much. This is a fascinating panel. My question is about framings of all of your work, because it strikes me that as we're talking about the intersections between all of our spaces, in some ways we all work on human rights, in some ways we all work on regulatory structures. And I think that based on my conversations with a lot of people in this room and who we all work with, there is a pessimism about the current status of human rights as a framework or a framing in the public conversation. What do you think about that? Given your respective positions at the cross section of human rights and other issues, what does the defense of the framework look like from your perspective? That's a really big question. Sorry.
That is a big question. I was in Switzerland last week, and the National Public Radio there, I did an interview, and the question was, am I fighting for a lost cause? I don't think that human rights is a lost cause. So I just want to start with a pro-human rights on Human Rights Day. There's more of us will win. So I'll start with that, but I'll turn it over to the panelists, and then I may have further reflections. Panelists.
Sure, I'll start, but I also share Amanda's view that I don't think we're fighting for a lost cause. I mean, listen, there's a lot of efforts by a lot of different either governments or other institutions to push back against the guardrails, as Amanda has framed them, or against international human rights frameworks. That's true. I think when you get down to it, most people around the world, whether they can put it in terms of, international human rights law language that would be recognized by some special rapporteur someplace, probably not. Do they know that their humanness entitles them to dignity and respect and care, and the right not to be pushed around and be told what they can and can't say? Yes. And while there's a very kind of I'm a lawyer, so this is no shade, but while there's a very big legal framework placed and built on top of those concepts that that guides our work, the fundamental truths remain that whether or not you're fighting a battle that's looking to strip some of that away, you can't take away that kind of core reality that people are not very excited about the prospect of being lied to, censored, stifled, or otherwise prevented from, living a life that they find fulfilling. And so I think as long as that's true, which I don't expect that to disappear anytime soon, whether it's in the frameworks that we've existed in or whether there are expanding or shifting frameworks, we're going to be able to hold on to that as an anchor and build around that.
Yeah, I have a very similar response, and maybe I will just add that I think the human rights movement is not necessarily always great about getting outside of its own head and getting outside of its own language, to explain why nobody in this room wants a family member enforceably disappeared. Everybody wants to have a say in how the world around them is governed, right? I mean, the sort of the actual application in a very personal sense. I have won more arguments with recalcitrant politicians by saying to them, is this how you want to be treated? And are you really going to pass up an opportunity to use the power that you have to keep other people from being treated this way? Is that really, I think there's much to be said for how we make these explanations and arguments and connect big, messy world politics, in circumstances where people don't necessarily see their own interests reflected. One of the examples I use all the time is to say, don't want another pandemic? Allow citizen journalists in China to do their jobs and say what they want. Don't lock them up. And people are like, oh, right. So, just a few examples.
And I'm an optimist. I agree with the theory that the arc of justice, bends towards, or the arc bends towards justice, whatever the quote is. I'm old enough to have lived through the dirty wars. I covered Latin America. I was based in Latin America in the early 2000s when justice came. It was slow, but it came. And I guess I think of it more like a 5-day test match in cricket, It kind of goes back and forth. I know most people don't follow cricket. I don't. But, I wanted to give an example where there's no seeming end in sight and you just go back and forth between positive and negative. But I do think, we have to keep in perspective, we've sometimes lose sight of the fact that it's not a one and done. It's always under threat, and it's always need to be vigilant, and goes backwards sometimes, and that's the role of NGOs and the media to spotlight injustice. You become a journalist generally because you have a low tolerance for injustice. I mean, you have that gene, and I think there are lots of people who have that gene, and I think it just means you work harder.
Thanks so much. And the polling numbers show that people also don't like corruption, right? So, one of the things that is important to work in these communities together is that fundamental sense of injustice and unfairness when the tipping point shows that people are enriching themselves at the cost of everyday people, that eventually catches up somewhere in the back and forth cricket. Other questions? Yeah, Kanan.
First of all, thank you for the panel discussion. My name is Kanan. I'm Master of Public Policy student at University of Maryland. I also work with Amnesty International on capstone project on topic surveillance on civic space. So surveillance technologies move across borders through private vendors. What do you think? What are the effective ways to establish global accountability for human rights abuses by these private actors?
Sophie, you know a little something about state surveillance. But yeah, any thoughts on state surveillance and how global regulatory or other types of regimes to address it?
Well, our organization had 11 reporters targeted with Pegasus, the spyware. We are under constant phishing and cyber attack. So yeah, it's front and center. It's just kind of the new reality you live with, and we've been spending some time, without scooping myself, looking at these zero-click software and the kind of the growth and proliferation, and it's just a reality. It's unfortunate, and the surveillance state is everywhere, and you see it with ICE now, with the ability to, and questions about what was accessed by DOJ and citizen information. So yeah, it's going to be a big issue going forward, and it's not going to get any easier. Use password protectors. That would be most people take it for granted, but there's, you'd be shocked at how much of your personal information is out there. Just subscribe to an OSINT tool and look yourself up, and you'll find that.
I'll just make 2 quick points. One is that I am an American, but after 25 years of marriage to a New Zealander, I understand cricket. So if anybody wants to go back to that analogy, we can do that. The Chinese government has an enormous capacity for and interest in and a lot of experience in global high-tech surveillance. A certain amount of it is still very low-tech. I mean, literally, people being followed, by another human being, very basic. Some of the kinds of information and data collection techniques that we would use in reporting or, gathering materials for a report. But some of the tactics are extremely high tech and difficult to detect. Some governments have taken steps towards making it a little bit easier to report on those behaviors in ways that I think still don't really lead to very effective pushback, either in a legal or a diplomatic sense. You'll occasionally see a case go to court about spying or surveillance or intrusion on personal data, things like that. But I think legal frameworks and political ones have a long way to go to catch up, at least with Beijing's capacity in this regard. I can't really speak to other governments. But when you see the U.S. government taking steps backwards on these kinds of issues, and indeed you're taking a much more, I would say, acquiescent position towards one of the world's most aggressive surveillors, it's a little worrying to imagine what other tools will be advanced in the next couple of years that it'll take years before we even know about them. But I think there are some basic protections that you can take in sort of your everyday life. being careful online, but also I think being aware of surroundings and being informed about, where you can take complaints and what kinds of protections you might be able to secure.
Can I ask the audience? A little blue light flashes and everybody knows you're recording. ICE somehow has gotten the ability to use meta glasses and recording themselves during these raids, and I'm pretty sure the blue light isn't on. So then you start getting into, is everybody equal here? We start getting into kind of an Orwellian situation of some animals are more equal than others. So I think there's a lot of, it cuts both ways. Privacy is certainly a concern, but the ability to use common use technology for other purposes is kind of a new element as well.
So that was a new terrifying thing. And and Amnesty has called for a complete moratorium on the proliferation of commercial digital spyware. It's obviously not a feasible to put the cat back in the bag, but that's part of the challenge is once it's out of the bag, then it's very difficult, and you don't know if you're a victim. It's not a victimless human rights abuse, but it is difficult to find the victim because you don't know that you've been under that surveillance. We've got room for one question more. All right, Scott.
I have two questions, one for Larry and one for David. Sorry, Kevin.
You can call me Larry.
Thank you for all the great work OCCPR. Now on? Yeah. Thank you for all the great work OCCPR has done, and I'm delighted to hear that you haven't been affected by the radical cuts to foreign assistance by the United States and frankly other governments. To what extent is the OCCRP model sustainable financially and otherwise in this current environment, while general media has declined? How can you do that? And then for David, yes, indeed, government regulation is on the wane on business. To what extent has business already taken on human rights awareness, given demands of consumers and employees? Is that another way of thinking about how to keep businesses in line when it comes to human rights?
I'll just answer that quickly first. Yeah, the fact that there's no guardrails doesn't mean businesses are required to veer into the, way off kind of established norms and engage in the worst kinds of behaviors. There are also actors with agency who can make independent determinations about how they want to conduct business and the externalities that they want to bring to the world. And so a lack of guardrail or a perceived lack of guardrail or a lack of enforcement of a piece of legislation doesn't mean that it's incumbent upon a business to go out and immediately engage in, as many acts of bribery or corruption or, silence as many human rights defenders as they can. There are bad actors in the world. That's true. I personally, in ICAR, I think overall, doesn't subscribe to the view that most people in companies wake up every day and think about how they can do the most damage in the world. That's just not, I don't think that's how most people approach their job. No one wants to be like a villain in the world. They have incentives that have been built for them around how they achieve success in their company, how their company achieves success, with respect to their competitors, how they, how each of those things can advance. And I think that there are ways in which both as advocates and NGOs and as consumers, as investors, we can bring a number of tools to bear that continue to make the case that while there may be a relaxed or withdrawn purely legal requirement within the jurisdiction that some of these companies are operating, that doesn't mean that there's a relaxed requirement from either investors, consumers, advocates, the media, others, brand reputational issues that wouldn't want to see these things continue. And many companies have fully internalized that it is part of their obligations, whether it's because of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights or OECD frameworks or other just industry-specific kind of frameworks, that they are continuing to embrace their role as, neutral to positive corporate citizens. The challenge for all of those companies is that oftentimes, it's just, fact of the matter, cheaper to do things the gross way. And, that's going to have to be something. The reason that those frameworks existed was to prevent the worst kinds of actions from being the most cost-effective way of doing things. It's like I've said, there's not a business case against using free labor. There's a lot of other cases, but there's just not a business case for it. And so that's where public interest and legislative frameworks need to come in. But there's absolutely, to end maybe on a more positive note on the guardrail piece, the fact that you don't have guardrails on the side of your road doesn't mean you're required to veer off and do the most damage. You can be, you can't exercise judgment, and many companies do. And I think then it's incumbent on us who work on the business, human rights, and corporate accountability space to focus on bad actors or to raise those stories and to make the case for why that's just not the way that companies need to or should behave.
I would agree. The only distinction I think I would make there is the FCPA. The argument forever has been, well, everybody else does it but us, it's not fair. Well, the solution isn't to say, well, go ahead and be a bad actor. It's to continue to press to have tighter regulatory frameworks and consequences. And I think you look at the range of people, particularly in Brazil, a country I know well, that the U.S. targeted how effective those sanctions were. And Odebrecht is out of business for the most part. They were a really bad actor. It's a good thing to enforce FCPA laws. On the question of how sustainable we are, time will tell. It's not my area of expertise, but I can tell you that generally speaking, we've been able to raise a good bit of money off of this to offset it. So we're not going anywhere anytime soon. More broadly, I think donors in the United States in particular, what we're hearing, I'm not speaking about OCCRP, but I interface with a lot of NGOs in this space, and I think broadly speaking, donors are worried about this administration and targeted. You can see the Open Society actions they've been taking and the actions against Comey and against, so people are eyeballing that. And are American donors opening up their wallets in the way that they might have before all this? Probably not just for us, but across the board. And again, hopefully that's a temporary thing, and over time things normalize. But thankfully, the Europeans in particular have held their ground, and we're seeing the same kind of efforts in Europe that we had here to allege that, there's censorship and people's rights are being taken away, and all for basically trying to stop disinformation. So I think the Europeans are starting to see the kind of pressure we had over the last 2 years here. You're seeing more in Europe, and I do think in Eastern Europe in particular. And then you look at the cast of people who are lobbying on behalf of those people in the United States, and you can put 2 and 2 together.
Thank you all for your questions, and thank you all for joining us today. And now we have gone over. And so now I will turn it over to Jeff to... Do you have any closing remarks you want to make? I'm just grateful for the conversation today. I feel like it really sparked some... And also the side conversations around coffee and beverages. It's great to be in person together with so many of you. We hope to continue to have in-person events so that there's a space for dialogue and conversation. I'm grateful to the work that so many of you do, both within the U.S. government, continue to do the good work that you're doing. We're grateful for you, and within the civil society space. So thank you all.
Can we say something nice about Amnesty as well? That just having done this over a long period, Amnesty has done so many great things over the years, and you think back to the 80s, and it's certainly before that and after that, but can't say enough nice things about Amnesty as well.
Let me hold the panel hostage here just to close us off. I think a lot of us, this is a very U.S.-focused conversation today. I think a lot of us do work internationally. The Forum on the Arms Trade is international. ICAN, 1,600 people around the world. Amnesty has chapters all over the world. I think a lot of us are involved with these networks globally. I just want to share in sort of my work with some of these networks over the year. one of the things someone told me once is that when the superpower gets sick, everybody else in the world gets a cold. And I think that stuck with me. And we did a convening in New York a couple months ago, and a lot of people couldn't come from around the world, and they said, you all need to get your act together in the United States instead of telling us what to do. It was sort of a funny thing to end this conference in. But I think I think that's all true. And I think we have some allies here that aren't from the United States who can push on the United States, which I'd love you to do. But I think when we often look at other countries, we don't see the people like us there that are standing up, that are fighting, that are trying to make change. And I think this was a gathering of people in the United States that if some of my friends around the world could see us here and what we're trying to do, would take a lot of heart in the efforts that are happening. One of the goals, obviously, for bringing this collection of people together was that hopefully you met or heard from someone you've never seen before, some ideas that maybe resonate with you that you hadn't thought of them that way. I'm from Texas too, and one of my observations in moving to Washington, D.C. is that it is a place where a lot of people with great brains end up. And just listening to the people today, I felt was great. And I organized it, so I'm going to say that, but I actually think it was true. So I want to thank you all for being here. This is recorded. We hopefully have a recording in a week. I promised to write this up over the weekend. I might not make that deadline, but we do want to sort of have a follow-up report and some ideas that come from this, so hopefully we'll get that and can make some connections there. But I think on behalf of all the organizers, we are some of those networkers, so feel free to get in touch with us, to get in touch with others or people you met here. And thank you all. Thank you, Jody and Amanda, for making this happen. And couple more weeks left in 2025. In 2026, we'll see how it goes, but let's keep pushing. Thanks. And sorry, I have to say, one of the issues we didn't talk about is today is also the national gathering in Washington, D.C. on domestic gun violence prevention, which I cannot go to this year, but the ties in the small arms trade and Mexico and other countries has starting to get attention, and Representative Castro is in some of that. But anybody interested, tonight is the National Gun Violence Prevention Vigil from 7 to 9:30 at St. Mark's on Capitol Hill. Just wanted to make an announcement. They asked me to do that, but I think it's important to recognize some other allies. Thank you, sorry.